Hello, and welcome to a Sunny Book Nook. My name is Sunny, and today I'm going to be sharing with you some of my nonfiction reads of last year, 2022, because I've read around 20 nonfiction books, and I am going to talk about all of them, but in two different videos. This video is the one where I am discussing the books I'm categorizing as like memoir or like memoir-ish personal essay collection type books, and the other video is going to be the nonfiction that is like history or theory, that type of stuff. So that is the deal. And I'm going to be going through these nonfiction books in the order of enjoyment. So I enjoyed all of the nonfiction reads of my last year, but I'm going to go in like escalating levels of enjoyment. So it's not least favorite to favorite, it's more like enjoyed to like absolute top tier favorite read of the year for nonfiction. And so that's the deal. So let's just get started. The first book I'm going to be talking about, the first nonfiction book on this list, is Disfigured by Amanda Leduc. This book is a bit of a memoir, a bit of just talking about what it means to be disabled as a like fiction writer, and how fairy tales and narratives about disability and disfigurement have shaped the author's understanding of her own disability and disfigurement, and what existing in society as a disabled person within the narratives of like Beauty and the Beast and the crippled character and the dwarf character and the characters who are deemed villainous or have to experience change due to their disfigurement. That's sort of what this book goes into, and the author goes into her own personal experiences with depression and her mental health and struggles as a like mother and in her relationships and such as well. And she brings together these like metaphors and comparisons and delineations about fairy tales and like pieces of disability theory and stuff without making this book about disability theory or like a piece of it or fairy tales and like about it. It's a personal memoir with all of those things entangled with it, and I think that in some ways it's kind of simplistic because it touches on all these topics on a somewhat surface level. And I also think that it does what it says it's going to do. So yeah, I was satisfied with this read. I got from it what I expected I would get, but without the depth that I necessarily wanted. I don't know if it told me anything new necessarily, but I think it was still pretty solid and I would definitely recommend it. And it was a good like personal memoir narrative. And yeah, that's also kind of how I feel about this next book, but I like this book I think a little more, and that is A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott. This book is definitely more of a memoir than Disfigured. Our author is half white, half native, and she's from Canada, I believe, and she is Mohawk. So essentially, A Mind Spread Out on the Ground is a Mohawk way of describing depression, essentially. And so she talks about her experiences with like mental health and growing up in a very poor and religious family, and what it means to be like, for her, a mixed Native woman who is like white passing in some senses and still be deeply informed by her Indigenous heritage, and also the legacy of like colonial trauma within her family and in her body, and also her experiences being like a young mom and getting into writing for the first time. I think this whole book was very moving and vulnerable in everything that the author shares with us about her struggle with mental health, her deeply traumatic and abusive household, and the trauma of poverty and colonialism. And she brings in the like statistics and general realities of issues of indigeneity within Canada and mental health and stuff, with her own family stories and her own experiences, of course. And yeah, so the sort of messages that she gets across, again, aren't necessarily things that I hadn't heard before, but that wasn't necessarily why I came to the book in the first place. You know, I think it's with memoirs and such, and with personal essays and with personal storytelling about one's own life, it's more about, you know, how that person has experienced and come to the conclusions that they did based off of those experiences and their life story. And so I think that her life story and her sort of narrating of the path that she took to get to where she is was very, very moving and simplistically written, but in a way that I think was effective at conveying what needed to be conveyed. And I think that is also true of the next book, which is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy, which everyone has been reading and talking about this past year, of course. I also read this and really enjoyed it. Well, not enjoyed it, but like it's because it's a harrowing and traumatizing read about a young woman's traumatizing and harrowing experience with a deeply abusive mother and her really, really fucked up relationship with food and her body and eating, and her eating disorder, as well as sort of getting forced into the Hollywood machine as an actor, even though that was never really something she wanted. That was just a dream that her mother pushed her into. And she talks about the struggle of all of these things and narrates it in a way that conveys her perspective from the emotional point of view of the age range that she is conveying at each point, while also empathizing with her younger self and different members of her family. And I think it was a deeply empathetic and moving memoir that was so vulnerable and also pretty simplistically written in order to convey that vulnerability. And I was definitely really, really moved by it. She is very blunt and straightforward and clear and explicit about all of the effects of her anorexia and bulimia and her relationship with her mother. And it's very disturbing, obviously, and it's meant to be because it was obviously a very disturbing and traumatic experience for her growing up in that environment. So yeah, just but it was a good read. All of these books were good, and I would recommend them. And the next book I want to talk about on this list is The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson. It's sort of memoir, autobiography, writing, motherhood, poetry book. What does the back say? Is a genre-bending memoir, a work of auto-theory, offering fresh, fierce, and timely thinking about desire, identity, and the limitations and possibilities of love and language. It binds an account of Nelson's relationship with her fluidly gendered partner, and a journey to and through a pregnancy to a rigorous exploration of sexuality, gender, and family. An insistence on radical individual freedom and the value of caretaking becomes a rallying cry for this thoughtful, unabashed, uncompromising book. So yeah, I think auto-theory is like a good way of describing it, because she talks about like literary theory and different literary figures and thinkers and like philosophers and artists, especially women artists and artists who are mothers and their experiences in like the field, and then her own experience being a mother and her relationship with Harry, who transitions during the course of their relationship, and also I think Maggie Nelson's pregnancy and like her raising this baby and having this baby. It was really moving and gorgeous and like lesbian desire and love and writing in many ways, while also looking at what even identity and like labels and what the meaning of them, why they're important, when they're not, how it figures into the author's life, what she as a writer sort of has experienced as a woman in the field and then becoming a mother, and like the advice she is given and reads about being a mother and what is applicable to her or not. It is a book that is recommended to every lesbian like that I've ever met, and every lesbian has heard of this book, I swear to God. And I get why. I get why it's essential dyke reading, because I think it definitely is. I think it asks and answers a lot of questions that are very thoughtful and thought-provoking and vulnerable and really intelligent. It's a very, again, like, it's such a thoughtful book, but it's also so much about like love and family, and it was beautiful. So I did really enjoy this. The next two books are both essay collection type memoir books, and this one is Trick Mirror by Gia Tolentino. These books kind of match each other in like the hot pink and black white color scheme. That's interesting. But Trick Mirror, I finally read because everyone has been throwing this book in my face for the past like 3 years that it's been out. 4 years that it's been, 5 years. How long has this fucking book been out? It's been out for forever, I feel like. But I finally read it in 2022, and I get why everyone was recommending it. It is pretty dang fantastic. I don't necessarily agree with every conclusion that Tolentino comes to necessarily, or nor do I think every conclusion that she comes to is very clear, but I think that a lot of the things that she says and the way that she conveys her own life story and the feminist consciousness points and the bits and pieces of like what it means to be on the internet now throughout here are quite incisive and brilliant. And Tolentino is a fantastic writer and has a sort of biting insight and critique on contemporary culture in a way that is really like refreshing and honest and smart. It's a look at like internet culture and gender culture and the culture of looking at oneself always that we currently live in, and it's just very interesting. I think her essay about being on a teen reality show was really, really funny and so like intriguing. I think her essay on like ecstasy and drugs and being in an evangelical church in the South was fascinating. I think her essay about criticizing women versus feminist pop culture, it's like, oh, is someone a feminist just because they are a woman? And I wrote a whole essay about that as well, like conservative women being feminists or whatever. And she sort of makes the argument that, like, they're not. Her essay, The Cult of the Difficult Woman, where she sort of argues that, like, when misogyny and the misogyny that a woman faces becomes the arbiter of her worth, it's like, well, how is that not? What does that mean? Because that's sort of a lot of what contemporary culture and feminist discourse has brought about in some ways. I thought that was interesting. I really liked her piece on, like, I liked her always be optimizing piece. Towards the beginning of the essay, she says, the ideal woman always believes she came up with herself on her own. And leading up to it, she says, everything about this woman has been preemptively controlled to the point that she can afford the impression of spontaneity and, more important, the sensation of it, having worked to rid her life of artificial obstacles. She often feels legitimately carefree. And she goes into the specific different points of, like, everything from sweet green to Pilates. Like, it's interesting. I think the way that she talks about patriarchy and capitalism and the things that shape women's lives and like the internet and self-perception from her own perspective and her own life, and also as a cultural critique, was pretty smart, and I liked it. It made me want to write, and I yeah, it was solid. But my favorite essay collection of the year was definitely The Hard Crowd by Rachel Kushner. Did I talk about this? I talked about this book in my December wrap-up. It was the first book I read in December, and I fucking loved it. This book is brilliant. absolutely brilliant. I have read Rachel Kushner's book, The Mars Room, which is set in a women's prison. And it's so interesting how the different essays in this essay collection kind of reveal the different aspects, the different specific arenas and environments that have informed the other books that she has written. Because the Mars Room is obviously set in a women's prison in California. She grew up in California to like sort of hippie-ish parents, and she has an essay in here about prison abolition, and she brings in the ideas of like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis, and the question of like, you know, are prisons obsolete, and the conversations going on around that, and with organizations such as like Critical Resistance and stuff. But she like, you can tell that her interest in this is obviously sparked by and driven by the fact of her novel, or that her novel is driven by her interest in prison abolition. It's like one of those things that's like tied together. But each of the essays in here are so hyper specific, yet reveal so much about both obviously Rachel Kushner's life and experiences, as well as like our contemporary cultural landscape, and also just like 20th century culture and history. Because the first essay is about like motorcycling and the motorcycle racing culture that she was involved in. There's an essay in here where she's talking about like the different bars she was in. There's an essay in here where she talks about like all the militant leftist Italian organizing, because that informs the one of the books that she's written. She like name drops a lot of different famous people and stuff and bands that like I have no cultural context for, because I don't know any of these people and I'm unfamiliar with like the rock scene of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I don't really give a fuck, but I just thought it was so interesting to hear her perspective and like what she cared about. I don't give a fuck about motorcycles, but I thought it was interesting to hear about. I don't know anything about the autonomous workers resistance movement in the 70s in Italy, but I thought it was really interesting to hear her thoughts and her interview process. There's also a really gorgeous essay called We Are Orphans Here, where she's in the Shuafat camp in Palestine and talking to these different Palestinian refugee families being led by this person named Baha, and it was so moving. Yeah, so the first essay is Girl on a Motorcycle. So interesting. Like, she goes into all the different, like, brand names of the motorcycles and the different, like, places that she got it, the different names of the people who won this race, and, like, her experience going on the race, the man that she was dating who, like, helped her get involved in it, the fact that when she was growing up, her dad was always really into motorcycles. And then the second essay was We Are Orphans Here, which is the essay about her going to Palestine. And then Earth Angel is about Dennis Johnson. It's sort of like a journalistic type Joan Didion-esque like profile almost, and I think like that is what is so fantastic about her writing, is how fresh and contemporary but like vintage it feels. And then okay, this essay is In the Company of Truckers, and she talks about like, okay, so she starts it off with like, one summer in the late 1990s, I was driving across the country on I-80, having just stopped to visit some friends in Des Moines, Iowa. I was behind the wheel of a 1963 Chevrolet Impala I'd bought outside Asheville, North Carolina. She loves cars and vintage cars. And she talks about that a lot. And then this is a really short essay where she talks about a trucker helping her out when her car breaks down. And then this next essay is called Bad Captains. It's where she goes to the sea and she talks about the Costa Concordio and Captain Schettino and like this ship that sank, I think. Again, it's so hyper specific. And then there is a piece on Happy Hour where she talks about Jeff Koons and the sort of dissonance between how Jeff Koons is viewed versus his art, and the sort of consumerism of the art world and the falseness of it versus her understanding and engagement within it. Then the next essay is Tramping in the Byways, where she talks about David Rattray and her relationship to the book How I Became One of the Invisible. So like, she goes into all these hyper specific like niche cultural references about books and art and film and movements that are just like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about, but I'm gripped. I'm interested. There's so many different proper nouns on every page, but it's like I'm eating it up the whole time. She talks about like the Americana aesthetic and the way that Rattray as a writer sort of goes into these different literary theories and explorations of different landscapes and stuff. Oh, and then she goes, this next essay is called Flying Cars, where she talks about all the different cars that she's had, essentially. And then that's a really short one. Then there's an essay called Picture Book Courses, where she talks about like Western films and like women in Western films and Western books as well. Very short. And then there's a longer essay called Not with the Band. It's pretty like all of these essays are pretty short, but each one is very gripping, I think. Not with the Band is like her basically working the New York bar scene in like the 90s or something and like meeting like fucking PJ Harvey and shit. It's really cool. If you're into all of this, like, you would love this, I think. And then Made to Burn is about writing her book The Flamethrowers, which is what the Italian autonomous workers, like Red Brigades thing is about. And there's like all these photos and stuff that are references of the art and moments of the movement. I just went through all of the different essays of like the first half of this book, but that's the vibes if you're picking up what I'm putting down, you know? And so, yeah, I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a really smart, incisive essay that took the hyper specific and made me fascinated, even though a lot of these topics were things that I wasn't interested in prior to reading them, you know, but then after I read the essay, I was like, let me pick up that book, like, or I would just be like, wow, now I know this thing about this hyper-specific topic that I didn't know anything about before from the perspective of this phenomenal woman writer. So there's that. Those are all of the memoir-ish essay collection type personal autobiography nonfiction books that I read in the past year. I enjoyed all of them. Let me know what you think of any of these books if you have read them. The second part of this video where I talk about the nonfiction and theory books that I read this past year will be coming soon, but I read a lot more of those books than the memoirs and stuff, so that video is going to be definitely a lot longer. So yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video, hopefully. Bye!